Good evening, everyone. This is Pradeep, Ambassador of Change for GETI, the Global Education and Training Institute of Lucknow. We are the premier training institute for principals and teachers all over India, and we have many in-service and pre-service programs. And for more information on this, you can go to 740-840-1000. Right now, you are on a disruptive education platform provided to us by our mentor, Dr. Sunita Gandhi. On this platform, we have met with and interacted with more than 1,300 educators from India and all over the world. And this evening, we have for you Ms. Ishita Mukhopadhyay. She's the professor, Department of Economics, University of Calcutta, West Bengal. She is the president of the Indian Association for Women's Studies, and she has been teaching and supervising research for 30 years now, and organizing movement for right to education in the country. Welcome, ma'am, and she will be speaking to us
Welcome.
today. She'll be speaking to us today on education for disadvantaged population. Thank you for being with us, ma'am, and
Thank
over to
you.
you.
Thank you. Uh, Actually, I'll be speaking on for disadvantaged population. And when we speak for disadvantaged population, we have to remember UNESCO. I'll be coming to you with a set of slides within the next few minutes, and I'll be discussing with you on the basis of the slides, data, and the situations. Now, who form the disadvantaged population? And why do I choose this as a topic? Because UNESCO, in Global Education Monitoring Report each year, which they give, defined disadvantaged population as a population group at risk of education exclusion as a result of sex, location, poverty, disability, ethnicity, language, migration, displacement, or other characteristics. Now, these cause educational inequality. How does this cause inequality? Now, regarding the sex, we know about the gender disparity. We know about the male female disparity. We have been talking about patriarchy and exclusion of girls. But we also should be aware of, in fact, the world has been changing, and a new consensus is now being developed about this educational deprivation regarding the third gender. How are they treated at school and whether they are excluded? And we find a lot of exclusion. Location. Location means whether the simple location is whether you're staying in the rural area or in the urban area, whether you get access to amenities. If you stay very close to proximity to the educational institution, will help one to achieve education. But if the proximity is much greater, if the distance is much greater, then the educational association or the educational access gets gets smaller and smaller. Location, where are they located? Location is a very important factor. Of course, poverty, uh, which has been the order of the day, where we see a large number of poor population without any access to education. Disability, that is the disabled population, both physically and mentally disabled, you need special institutions. And now you have law consensus, but still we have miles to go. Ethnicity, that is the race and cultural ethnicity, and also tribes and castes. So, as you can see, that these ethnicities are depriving people from education. And so right to education is a contested issue, is a much loaded issue, is to be discussed at each level. Migration, people migrating from one place to the other and finding them and children are out of the school and higher education, they get out of higher education and they join work, which we saw very much during the COVID times throughout the world, particularly in India. Language. Language is also a kind of exclusion because you have not only languages, but you also have dialects. For example, many Adivasis or tribals speak in a language which is not a recognized language in the textbook, and the teacher, the instructions, manuals are not customized to the kind of language they speak. And other characteristics, displacement, dislocation and displacement. For example, the climate refugees. And we recently had the Glasgow Climate Summit where we talked about climate refugees. We talked about the climate challenge, which is throwing people um, out of their locations, and there is displacement. Obviously, education takes a back seat in all these considerations. So it is quite justified why UNESCO called the specialized group of disadvantaged population a point of concern. So, educational inequality is a fact. This is a fact. This is not to blame somebody, but it's a fact which we have to accept. Now, exclusion of disadvantaged population is also a fact in the globe and in India. Now, the question before all of the countries, particularly our countries, that why are we bothering about educational inequality? What happens if we don't have education? Now, educational inequality, does it cause economic inequality? Or the vice versa, economic inequality causes educational inequality? We see both influencing each other. So ultimately, this is catering to the country's development, country's human capital. So it's not a concern for that person alone who is out of the track. It is also a concern. It's not a question of sympathy or empathy to the particular persons who are excluded. It's also a concern for how, it is also a concern that how much you love your own country, so that the educational inequality is a matter of concern. So disadvantaged population should be a top priority when we consider the right to education for all sections of the people. And right to education is an essential factor towards development and growth of any country. So if you just look at this kind of a data, which is also from UNESCO, we find that the data from 2000 to 2018 is showing that the exclusion or out of school population for the primary, for the lower secondary, and for the upper secondary. I'm talking about the school level in this graph. So as you can see that it is decreasing. The exclusion, the level of exclusion in terms of number, it is decreasing. There is less exclusion in the primary age. There is more, of course, with respect to female than with respect to male in the primary as well as in the upper secondary, but not with respect to lower secondary. However, if we look into these bands, we see still a sizable number is excluded. If we look into the world, there is a sizable number is still out of education, and it is great. The sizable number is great. So as a whole in the globe, we find it's falling, but of course there is inequality between the countries. I'm giving you a snapshot today, but there are details of country-wise details where you will see that all the countries do not show this uniformity, and you have disparities between the countries, as it is with respect to location, with respect to ethnicity. There is a difference between the black and the white, the way in which, as you know, in United States, the Black Lives Matter movement started, and it's a long movement, and there is a deprivation. Here also, in India also, we have the caste and Dalit deprivation, as we can see. So it cuts across regions, it cuts across all barriers, it cuts across gender also. Now, this gives you a glimpse, but it has got this inter-country variations. Now, why are we concerned? The concern is being shown by the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 4, 2030 agenda, that within 2030, there are several goals. I'm picking out the education ones. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. That learning opportunities must be there. And this goal 4 has got many targets, but are just picking up 3 targets, which is um, relevant to the right to education, and why this exclusion for a disadvantaged group comes in very much particularly, comes face to face with all of these targets. Target 4.1, free primary and secondary education. That is, primary and secondary education must be free for all. Target 4.2, equal access to quality pre-primary education. When we talk about quality pre-primary education, what do we mean? It means learning ability. It means teaching learning skills. So learning ability, it's not only making the children sit down in school and go on and getting how to crack exams, but it also giving you quality pre-primary education, which engages in bringing up the child's ability, which ultimately goes up to build up the human capital. For example, in the pre-primary education, you need, of course, the question of nutrition comes in, because the nutrition is very much related to the development of the biological development and the anatomical development of the body. And a healthy body will of course lead to health, to more absorption of education. So that's why you have to have the meals packed up with education. They has to be together. In India, we have this ICDS, Integrated Child Development Program, and of course, in India we have this midday meal program. Then the target 4.3, equal access to affordable technical, vocational, and higher education. So there should be equal access. Now, sometimes we see the problem is that you have the legally equal access. We also have the equal access in these forums. In the all schools, you have schools and you have um, um, these colleges, you have universities. Just now I'm sharing a news from where I'm coming from. I'm coming from West Bengal. I'm just sharing a news that due to COVID, many children left school, out of the school, and mostly they are from underprivileged, mostly they are from these vulnerable groups, mostly the underprivileged population. And we find that even after we have moved on to offline classes, even after we moved on to offline classes, then what has happened is that 79 of the schools in this state ceasing to operate. Why? Students are not coming. Either the girls, there have been extreme increase in child marriage. The girls have got married and the boys have gone back to work. And they have gone to work as agricultural laborers in the rural area. In the urban area, they have gone to work. So what happens is this: income inequality is reinforcing educational inequality. Whereas with educational inequality, the income inequality will persist for generations. So what happens is this, that if we do not care for this concern, it is going to have a long-term effect on the economy. It is going to have a long-term effect on the society as such. So this is the our sustainable development goals, and India is a signatory to these sustainable development goals along with many other countries of the world. So both of these go together. So we have the mandate of taking care of the excluded population, and India is a signatory, like many other countries who are also signatory. There is a target 4.5, which is clearly talking about eliminate all discrimination in education, inclusion of vulnerable groups, gender parity, build inclusive educational institutions. The institutions should also be, this is something very important, and it is, there are some norms which in the society which persist with existence of these vulnerable groups, and the vulnerability and the underprivileged is going on with these norms. There are norms that whether they will be able to, whether they will be able to learn or not, that is, whether the learning disability of vulnerable groups and underprivileged is systemic or not. Since their parents didn't learn, their earlier forefathers didn't learn, so they carry on genetically this trait of non-learning and the basic instinct of learning, if we call about instinct. So this is a standard theory, myth, which goes around in the institutions, which is totally untrue. Because going by experiments, if you separate two identical twins, and there have been innumerable kinds of experiments with this, that you separate two identical twins in two separate environments, give them different kinds of associations, different kinds of institutions, they grew up differently. So it is not all whatever you carry on with your genetically. If your brain is to be developed, the brain develops partly with your family association and partly with your institutional association, which the others, which the policies, which the policymakers and the environment can easily see. So these can be done. It's a doable task. It's not that it is not possible to eliminate all discrimination in education. And the underprivileged has to be taken care of. Then does WTO recognize SDG? See, the countries are signatories to a lot of existing protocols and treaties. Now, World Trade Organization, how does trade come here? Trade comes here because WTO recognizes education as a private consumption good where educational services are tradable. What do you mean by tradable educational services? That is, countries can now buy and sell educational services. I don't mean to say this international knowledge system, which was already there right from the beginning, because nobody prevented the knowledge of Renaissance to flow out from the place of origin. So nobody prevented Newton's theory to flow out from the place of origin. Nobody prevented Aryabhata's zero to flow out from the place of origin. So international knowledge system was already there, and you cannot have boundaries on the international knowledge system. International knowledge system is a holistic structure. But when you talk about the fact that they are tradable, it doesn't mean you're talking about this international knowledge system, the global knowledge system, which always existed prior to the WTO formation and prior to all these kinds of formation. So education can be priced by private companies and corporates and not only decided by the state. So this is the outcome. So privatization and commercialization in educational facilities, which does not go by the policy, which does not go by the education commission reports of the countries, of the particular country studies on education, which does not go by the existing research, this is also coming out. So education is leading to human capital of the country, and this is not conforming to the human capital of the country, because of course the profit making companies do not care or should not care about the human capital of the country. It's a macro concept. So the accessibility of education conflicts with profit, that there's a conflict. So in societies and economies, you have conflicts like this because of two different kinds of motives, two different kinds of objectives. But the accessibility conflicts with profits, who settles this? The international treaties settle this, and the country or the states settle this. That is the state, what we form the government policies, they settle this. This has particularly affected the right to education in India, where you do not find a single, you do not find that the educational commission reports like the Kotari commission reports and others are being taken care of in India, which has talked about these long ago. Now, business in education. So, what we see is that with the neoliberalism, with this WTO, we have business in education and we have $1 million international trade in educational services. These are facts. And what I'm talking about is facts. And this is not I'm not speaking from a judgmental point of consideration, but this is a fact. And and if this is happening, then you have to understand what would be its impact on the sustainable development goals, on the UNESCO findings. So business prospects in education increased with the trade. Poverty and economic inequality here became a cause of educational discrimination. So, what happened is this: since this is combined with an increasing poverty and economic inequality, as I started on the first slide with that both educational inequality and economic inequality reinforces each other, here became a cause of educational discrimination. Shadow was there in framing of new education policy 2020. We find exactly this shadow in framing of the new policy, and the vulnerability came out in the policy. The India is in a vulnerable position, particularly in the post pandemic situation, because when we find in the new education policy, the 66-page draft, what we found is that in this draft, the clusters, the grouping of the colleges and the clusters, the withering away of the existing education institutions and making up of the new institutions, whether they are conforming to the economic criteria or to the educational criteria, this is becoming a conflict. The conflict is throughout in the new education policy. And sometimes the conflict, we know that who are the powerful people in the economy. If we look into the Oxfam Inequality Report, we see the powerful people in the economy. We see how the rich and the super rich people are growing. And of course, they have got, like the rich countries and the poor countries, the rich countries have greater say. So the rich people has greater say in the economy and they control the business in education. So shadow was there in framing of the new education policy. India is in a vulnerable position in the post pandemic, particularly we find situation is worse than what it was in the pre pandemic. Now pandemic has affected population throughout the country and throughout the world. It has affected education throughout the world. So then we need a new educational structure and institution. We need to have to invent how to prevent the underprivileged from going out of education. Most of the underprivileged in the country are now out of the education system after the pandemic. This was not so in the pre-pandemic. This was not so in the pre-pandemic. Why I'm telling? Because in India is a country, if I go by lots of research surveys, it is telling us that the parents spend their priority money on education of children rather than on buying assets. They buy assets, but their priority spending is on children of the education. Why? Because um, educational inequality is supposed to end the economic inequality. So that is a myth. That is an understanding which India has understood. Whether that is true or not, that's a separate thing. But this is something which the Indians have understood. So the means of exclusion of disadvantaged groups is being there in this new policy, move towards cluster schools and colleges. Now, what happens when it is a cluster schools and colleges is that you have less schools, but with more student intake. Now, what happens is it doesn't care of the accessibility. Whereas if we go by the sense, Amata sense capability approach, you should have school for every child. You should have road for every child, food for every child, and there should be colleges can be put at a distance. So one railway station means one school, one bus stop means one school. So this is the idea of this of the schools. So if they are clustered together in a distant place, then we fail by the proximity norm. And if the proximity norm is failed, because then this exclusion is more and more. So the cluster schools and colleges, this proximity norm is failed. Again, the grouping of the special groups together in this policy, disability groups, Dalit, Adivasis all together, whereas they suffer from the different dimensions of inequality in the society. All the inequalities cannot be put down in one side of a mathematical equation. It's not an algebraic equation. It's not like that in the X you have all kinds of inequalities together. They have different shades and different dimensions. Even in the disability, you cannot put all the disabilities together. The blind people will be having a kind of disability. They need a special kind of instructions. They need a special kind of educational institution rather than the deaf and dumb people, rather than the spastics. So you have a separate kinds. These heterogeneity in the inequality of the underprivileged is there. One cannot pull down all underprivileged under one umbrella. But this is exactly what is done in this policy, that the all underprivileged has been put down under one umbrella, which is practically becoming unachievable. The intention is to take care of the underprivileged, but it doesn't take care of the heterogeneity where it means special attention, and it is a problem. So India is in a vulnerable position, particularly in the post-pandemic situation. And this is a special kind of situation which India is facing. I don't know why am I calling it post-pandemic, because post-pandemic means post-initiation of the pandemic. We are still living in pandemic. So the post initiation of the pandemic, here we have a conflict between we had a conflict between life and livelihood. And when we had a conflict between life and livelihood, people without livelihood cannot put their children to schools, and those who were even in higher education had to join work, whatever kind of work is possible. Whatever work is possible is this to the to leave their education, because education is giving them a long run perspective, whereas people's life are being taught within a short span or short run perspective in this kind of living in pandemic world. Many children, and even if they are above 18, are without their parents now. We have many orphans. So the life and livelihood, of course, this conflict is being extended towards life and education. That whether to have life and or whether to have education, it's a sad state of affair what we find today. So, move towards cluster schools is not going to help under this situation. Accessibility does all the, or even if all the schools, all the universities, all the colleges, all these institutions and the libraries, this is something very important. The libraries, are they having accessibility for, are they disabled friendly? Are they having all these accessibilities? Then the digital divide is something which has divided the along with the online teaching platform. Like, I'm using an online platform, but it's also true, I'm not going into the data today, but it is also true that you have this divide. Many of them, this is not approachable, the device is not approachable, the bandwidth is not approachable, the 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 internet is not approachable. So this doesn't reach to all places. If it naturally doesn't reach to all places, how can we have this online mode as a uniform mode throughout? On the other hand, apart from using this, one can use the community radio or the television, which grows everywhere. Why didn't we use one of the television channels as a particularly only for education? And the state education, the state provided channel should be can be there where everybody can access it. State provided radio services can be used. So there are ways out. I'm just giving you examples. There are ways out where one can resolve this conflict between life livelihood and life education. One can resolve this conflict. There are ways to resolve this conflict. Only one intention, only with intention. But we focused on life, we focused on livelihood, and of course it's not to blame anybody, people were in a fix, but also we had to focus on education. The developed countries focused on education during this period, whereas developing countries, many of the developing countries, and India is not called even a developing country now, but still we failed to focus. We had so much conflict between life and livelihood. Now, the Oxfam Inequality Report is giving us a data which is a glaring inequality data, is that proportion of population with secondary level education and above. If you look at this, if you look at these bars, we find that the poorest 10% and the richest 10% look at the sharp inequality in the rural and the urban area. In the rural area, as most of them are based on agriculture, though not many of them are disadvantaged, but as they are based on agriculture, we have lesser in the secondary level education. We have the lesser than, there is an urban rural disparity due to the amenities of the lesser amenities of the urban areas. But if you see the poorest 10% and the richest 10%, we find a sharp inequality. And this is growing over the last few years with the Oxfam Inequality Report. Now, this inequality means that uh, I'm coming back to my first question in my first slide, that educational inequality is enhancing economic inequality, or economic inequality is enhancing educational inequality and opportunities. We find both. So these poor people will remain poor in this generation and in the next generation and in the generation after the generation. So it's an inequality over a long period of life, over a long tenure, that is over generations we have inequality. Now, the caste-based discrimination, which we should be aware of, because we had this uh, very unpleasant incidents in our history in the recent times, with many SC/ST students, many Adivasi students being thrown out of education. We had very unpleasant facts. I'm not going to go by these facts, uh, but I'm going to share with you a data by the Education Ministry presented in 2019 Lok Sabha, which shows caste-based discrimination, that out of 6,043 faculty members at the 23 IITs, the I mean the most, I'm taking up the that the data takes up the most high ups elite institutions of the country. Of the only 149 were SCs, scheduled castes, and 21 were STS, scheduled tribe. So as you can see, the number of the SC/ST faculty members themselves, that is students moving up to faculty members, are also very low. They are abysmally low, accounting for less than 3% of the total faculty members. So this came out in this was presented in Lok Sabha, and this is of course repeated in the other kinds of of course uh, other areas. I'm not going up to all institutions, but this is the data, which is a glaring data. Similarly, out of 642 faculty members across 13 Indian Institute of Managements, only 4 belong to SC and 1 faculty member belongs to ST. This was 2019 data. The same pattern can be found in universities offering liberal art courses, such as University of Delhi, which has failed to implement the reservation policy. Out of the total sanctioned strength of 264 professors, it has only 3 SC professors and none from ST background. Now, it is not a question, I'm not arguing that they were not employed. I'm arguing on behalf of another fact from the other side, on the flip side of the story. That is, they are not there. That is, you do not find people who are actually uh, going up to this. So it is not, when you look at the applications, there are very few applications. So as you can see, you do not find them. So there is discrimination at both ends, from the demand side as well as the supply side. So it's a problem. So it's a problem which we have to face. These are facts. So this is a problem. And if we look at this annual survey of educational reforms data in 2021, ASAR survey is one of the surveys of Pratham. All of you must be knowing Pratham, the first non-profit organization which is working a great great details, carrying on surveys on education. In West Bengal, we have Amartya Sen's Pratiji Trust carrying on similar kinds of exercises, evidences on the basis of these surveys. Now, In the ASA survey in 2021, we find that the incidence of private schools in India has been rising over time. There's a steady increase in private schools from 2006 to 2014, plateauing around 30%. But then the number of private schools declined in pandemic. So incidence is rising over time up to 30% and then declining in pandemic. Increase in proportion of students enrolled in public schools. So there is now an increase in proportion of students in the pandemic situation enrolled in public school. This data came out from Delhi as well. No change in proportion of children not enrolled. Exclusion of disadvantaged is systemic. So that means the existing students were moving on from private to public schools, but the exclusion of disadvantaged is systemic. You have a systemic exclusion of disadvantage, and we haven't, which need to be taken care of. Increase in proportion of students taking paid tuitions. That means who can pay the tuitions. All India, 67.6% children have a smartphone at home. But even in such households where the households are having a smartphone, 26.1% children still have no access to smartphones. I'm not giving you the disaggregated statistics with respect to gender. The girl students have got lesser and lesser access to the smartphones. They often have to use the smartphones of their elder siblings, elder brother siblings, or their fathers or others, male members of the family. The data shows the higher percentage of females who have at least one smartphone in the home, the lower likelihood that children will have access to these phones, because the parents are having access to these phones for their work and they are working through these smartphones. So even if the online teaching is there, the children will have no access. Now, how doesn't this conflict with the idea that the parents take care of the children's education, but parents also have to take care of their own work? So again, the conflict between livelihood and educational opportunities is there. And it's a paradox that people carry on a livelihood to cater to their for the education of the children, but they cannot, and they have to take care of the food. India is also bad in the global hunger index. So India has also shown severe malnutrition in the NFHS 5 data. So the recent data glare at us and take us that not only livelihood is against education, which we are considering, we also have the nutritional standards, we also have hunger, we also have other things which are going against educational enrollment of the disadvantaged population. So a standard level of disadvantaged population always remain, and the educational disadvantage has increased. So I go back to my first slide where and I will end with this first slide, that again, this paradoxical question comes back again and again. Educational inequality causes economic inequality, or vice versa, or reinforced by both. So I think now I can end the presentation, and I go by the questions, and if there are comments, if there are any. And thank you very much for allowing me to join you and share some of my thoughts.
Thank you, ma'am, for that very eye-opening talk on education for disadvantaged population. Ma'am, what do you suggest that to improve this drastically? What do you suggest, especially for the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes?
Yes, one is that one needs to understand the diversity and heterogeneity. You cannot put down all SCs and all STs together. That is the Adivasis in the central part of the country, or in the southern part of the country, the underprivileged, and the northeastern tribals and in the Kashmir. You cannot put all parts of your country together. You have to understand the diversity and maintain the diversity and keep on producing knowledge material and additional effort and policies to bring students back to classrooms, going by this conflict. So of course, state education at the moment, state education is the top, has to be topmost priority, because it's going to cater to the country, because people of our age will not leave. We have lived our life of a very good education system, but as you can see that if we now visit the rural areas or in the urban poor households, they will clearly tell us, what will we do by teaching? We don't have anything to eat in the family, so we go for the livelihood. What will happen if I have education? I will have employment after 10 to 15 years, after 10 years or 50, 12 years, and looking at the job scenario, I may not get an employment. If I do something, how will I live through all these 10 years? How will I live through all these 7 to 8 years? So it needs to be a holistic package which one has to thought, keeping education for the underprivileged in our central vision.
Okay, ma'am, thank you, and good evening, everybody. And before we leave, I request you to watch our Detox, our disruptive literacy movement by Global Dream, which has been an initiative by Dr. Sunita Gandhi since 2014. This is to ensure everyone's participation in helping India achieve total literacy and numeracy. Each one, teach one is the basic slogan that has been around for a long time. And those of us who can afford to teach more than one, we should be teaching more than one to ensure that our brothers and sisters who are less privileged can come up to certain levels which will be of great use to them. And we have several talks on this every day. So for more information on the talks that you would like to listen to, please go to 7408401000. Good evening, everybody. Good night, and see you again tomorrow. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.